Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Welcome to Means of Grace. I'm Melissa McGill, the Conference Director of Communications. In today's episode, we highlight a unique opportunity for connection and creative ministry, led by our guest today, Brandon Lazarus. Brandon is an ordained elder in our conference and the director of the LEAD conference, which you'll learn more about in our show today. Welcome to Means of Grace. Our guest today is the Reverend Brandon Lazarus. Brandon is an ordained elder in our conference and the director of the LEAD conference. Welcome, Brandon. We're so glad to have you today.
Yeah, good to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm an elder here in Western North Carolina. I was actually ordained in South Carolina. Just last annual conference transferred my membership here to Western North Carolina. I was serving in South Carolina when I met my wife, who was living in Charlotte. And so we got married 4 years ago and then decided to ask for an appointment here in Western North Carolina. So I served 3 years at Memorial in East Charlotte. And then just this past July, moved to Morningstar in Canton, just 15 minutes away from Lake Junaluska. And so, yeah, we've enjoyed it here, but it has certainly been an adjustment to try to transition during the midst of a pandemic.
Absolutely.
All those things that I would have loved to have done of having people over to the parsonage and visiting them in their homes. Obviously, none of that can happen right now.
Right.
As we've all talked about and you've talked about in previous podcasts. But yeah, it's been good being out here up in the mountains. And, we had a very white Christmas. It was, quite a few inches of snow over Christmas. And so yeah, it's been nice being up here. And then also, as you mentioned, I am the director of the LEAD conference. And that's something that's been going on since 2012. And so, yeah, getting into the LEAD conference was something that happened just kind of by coincidence. I was in my second year of seminary. I went to Perkins School of Theology at SMU. And there was just a post that popped up on Facebook about some conference that was going on in Las Vegas. And they were asking for people to apply to speak. And at that time, when I was at Perkins, I lived at the Bonhoeffer House, which was part of the Epworth Project, which was part of the Missional Wisdom Foundation with Elaine Heath. And so I applied to speak about that and went out to Vegas, had a great time at that conference. That was the first year that they had it. And then found myself going every year since. And as the years went along, Rob Reinders, who was the one that started the LEAD conference, kind of asked me to take in different leadership roles. And so I kind of stepped into the role of director after, I think it was about 5 years of being a part of the LEAD conference. And so my first year actually serving as the director was, I guess it was the 2017 conference, which we had in Charlotte, because I was living in Charlotte at the time. And so I figured, it made sense to have it in my own backyard. And so, we moved around every year. The first 2 years were in Vegas, but then since then we went to Phoenix, Austin, Los Angeles, Charlotte, New Orleans, Denver. And then this last year it was in Seattle. And so, we were supposed to have it in San Diego. It was actually next week that it would have been in San Diego, but obviously we had to not do it in person this year.
Yeah. And I think the 2017 one in Charlotte, I actually attended that one. And I think that's the first time I met you. So, but for some of our listeners who haven't had any experience with the LEAD conference, can you tell us exactly what it is?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, Rob Reinders was the one who started it. Rob, at the time, was serving at Arizona State Wesley Foundation. And so he was in Phoenix. And then he had a friend of his, Glenn Simpson, who was living in Las Vegas. And the two of them started a conference that was actually geared towards young adults called Relevance X. Relevance X no longer is around. But as they were holding that conference, they noticed that in addition to the young adults that were coming to participate in the conference, the youth directors and Wesley Foundation directors and young adult pastors, when they were coming to the conference, they were kind of, sitting towards the back, talking to each other, getting to know one another, kind of sharing some ideas, after hours, going out with each other. And so from that, Rob said, well, what if we have a conference for them that's right before Relevance X. And so it was called Relevance Lead in the first year. And that was the same time when TED Talks were really starting to pick up. I think it was the year before that they actually had the first TED Talk that was posted online. And so what they decided was they would bring out different speakers to give TED style talks for the 2 days prior to the Relevance X conference. And that happened for 2 years in that form. But then Relevance X kind of dropped off, and then they went full force into the Lead conference. And so one thing led to another, and the Lead conference then broke off, did its own thing, continued to develop. And the year after we were in Phoenix, so that would have been, I guess, about 2015, they then decided to start something called UMC Lead. And so it started as the conference, but then also a blog. The blog has since stopped, but then the conference has continued to redevelop. And so the base of the conference is those talks. We usually give people between 8 and 18 minutes. For this year, for the online conference, they're just going to be 8 to 10 minutes. So we're going to make them a little bit shorter. And those are used for springboards. Because really what we're focusing on is not just coming out to hear experts or hear people talk about things, but to really build community and to kind of create that space. So for the in-person conference, in addition to the talks, we have breakouts, we have social opportunities, we have, depending on the context, different things that really highlight what's going on in that area. For instance, when we were in Denver, Dale Fredrickson, who is a clergy person out in Denver, but also a poet, put together an evening where there was poetry and music. And it was one of the greatest things that has happened at Lead. And so he did that one evening over at a small little brewery where it was a tiny room where we probably had, 100, 110 people packed in there into a room that could, barely fit 100. And then we also occasionally will do site visits to different ministries that are going on in the area. So for instance, when we had it in Charlotte, we did some visits out to like Sharon UMC, and that was way before they got to where they are now. Because again, that was 2017, so they were still in the old building at that time. But that was one of the places that we visited.
I actually went on that one too, and it was really cool because you got to see their plans. They had all the renderings and drawings. This was back in 2017, and then now just this past month they opened and they're in that building, and so it's really cool to have seen it at that process where your Lead participants were, and then now to have it come into fruition. So that's awesome.
Yeah. And so we went there, we went to QC Family Tree, Area 15, just a lot of different great organizations in the area. And so we always like to add a little bit different each year. So it's not just the same thing year in, year out. But we have found that pretty much 40% to 30% of the people who have attended Lead then come back to 2, 3, 4 years. And so it's clear that what we're building really is a community, that it's not just a conference that happens once a year, but it's a community that kind of continues on through the year. And then the conference is just kind of like a family reunion of sorts. And so it's been a great opportunity. And so we do plan to bring it back to the way that it was. Everybody says they want to go back, and obviously things will be different. But we do tentatively plan in 2022 to be going to San Diego, where we originally had planned to go. And so that one will also hopefully have site visits, because we'll be right by the border. And so some of those site visits will be at the border, working with immigration, all kinds of different things.
I love Lead's mission. So let me read it for our listeners. Lead creates space for Christian leaders to be vulnerable and courageous, connects them around their hopes for the future, and equips them to bring those hopes into reality. I just love that. So can you tell us more about what that means to you and why that is Lead's mission?
Yeah. So for the longest time, we didn't really know how to describe what Lead was. We had some different things and different words and things that we had thrown out there. But then I guess it was about 3 years ago, the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry invited us to come out to Nashville. Us being, at the time, it was me, Rob Reinders, Kim Montenegro, Chris Gallagher, and then Nathan Adams. And we went out there and kind of brainstormed on what is Lead, but then also what are the next steps? And so we spent 2 days out there brainstorming, talking through what is Lead. And then that's where that mission statement came out. Like, we didn't just sit down and say, what are those words? We said, first we started with the stories. And so we each told stories about what we love about Lead. what our experiences are, what we take from it, what other people have shared with us about their experiences with LEAD. And then from that came kind of those main points of, connecting and creating space. And then slowly but surely, we built out that mission statement into what you read. And so once we had that, we said, okay, well, we ended with, and then equips them to bring those hopes into reality. And so that was where we started to brainstorm about what it might look like for those next steps. And so we had a plan laid out to create a cohort that was, again, one of those things that was intended to launch this year. Right. But because of that, we've kind of put that back on the back burner. It's still something that we hope to do moving forward. But we're still looking at, what are ways in addition to the conference where we can continue those relationships, continue the development, and really help support those who are looking for that way to connect. Because as I mentioned before, that really, although those talks are those things that we can put online and the things that people maybe haven't been to the conference can experience, but it's really those connections that are made, because there have been years where someone meets someone at the conference and then the next year, maybe it's a district superintendent that has recruited that person to come serve in their conference to, plant a new church. There's also people from publishing houses that have come and heard a talk, or sometimes not even a talk, but just someone who was attending the conference. So they bring up this conversation, and then that ends up being a book. And so those are the kind of things that we can't really necessarily quantify in the same way that we can how many people have attended, how many people return. Right. But those are the things that are really special to see, of those ways that relationships are formed and then fruit comes from it. Sometimes, 2 or 3 years later after they've met at the conference.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So how are you translating that online specifically, especially creating space and having those connections are very in-person physical things. So how are you translating that to the virtual setting for this year?
Yeah. So it all kind of started the second week of March. We were scheduled to go and do our site visit in San Diego to plan the 2021 conference. And it was right around that time that COVID was starting to spread. Mm-hmm. And we were still trying to go up until 3 days before we were supposed to get on the plane. And finally we said, this is not safe. We're not going to do it. We're going to, put our hotel on hold, put the flights on hold. And then hopefully we'll be able to go visit San Diego in a couple months. We all know how the rest of that went. Yeah. But we continued to kind of wait and see. But then finally, it was probably around October that we finally called the hotel in San Diego, the Lafayette, where we're going to be hosting the conference. And we said, we're not going to be able to do it in person. Could we, by chance, postpone our contract to next year? And they were great about it. They gave us the same exact contract. And so we still have plans to go to the Lafayette. We still have plans to host at Normal Heights United Methodist. But then we asked the question of, okay, now what do we do? Do we just not have a conference? Do we, have something smaller scale? Do we have an online conference? What do we do? And so it took us probably weeks, if not months, of kind of brainstorming and looking at things to finally say, you know what, I think we can do something. Because that was the other thing we were asking, what is out there and what are we wanting to offer that's different? And one of the things is there have been a ton of conferences that have moved online, and a ton of workshops that have been made available. But what we wanted to do was create that space for people to kind of share stories and connect. That it's not going to be here's 5 steps to having a perfect church during a pandemic, or here's 10 tips for how to stream your church online. We're not looking for those kind of nuts and bolts digging into the weeds of how things should be done, but really focusing on what are those stories that can be shared. And so we're still going to have our talks. We're going to have 14 talks that are 8 to 10 minutes. And then we're also going to have times for breakouts. We're actually going to open each day 30 minutes early with what we're calling the front porch, where people can just come. We'll toss them in a breakout group so they can meet some other people and get to know one another. Then we'll start with some worship, have some talks, and then we'll have, again, some breakout groups after those talks that will, not your typical breakouts where there's a leader that's a workshop, but more of just kind of putting some people in a room, giving them some guiding questions and letting them reflect on what they've learned. And then we're also, one of the great things about the conferences is those opening mixers that we have. And so we can't go to a hotel and have hors d'oeuvres and all of that. But we will have opportunities. There's going to be 2 opportunities on Sunday night. And if you register for the conference in a week or so, we're going to be sending out the invitation to these events. But one of those will be a painting that's Andrew Ayane is going to be doing kind of like your typical wine and paint type events. And so he'll be teaching people how to paint something, and we'll send out like an Amazon list so that people can make sure that they have all their stuff. And then the other one is going to be like a murder mystery. So Trevor Warren is going to be hosting that for us.
That's cool.
And then Monday night, we're going to have 2 opportunities as well, where Sophia Actorap, who last year in Seattle had a wonderful closing dinner, where it was mostly Filipino food that she had kind of laid out. We all ate with our hands and we shared stories, and it was a great opportunity. And so she's going to be teaching us how to cook something. We don't know what yet, but she's going to teach us how to cook something. And then the other opportunity is going to be Jerry Herships, who is now in Aspen, but he was in Denver before that with After Hours. And he's going to be sharing some stories and teaching some people how to make some different mixed drinks. Prior to going into ministry, he was a bartender and comedian and stand up. And so I think that'll be a great opportunity as well for people to connect after kind of the nuts and bolts of the conference.
Very cool. That's awesome. It sounds like you guys have put a lot of work into rethinking how to keep the heart of it in a new setting. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it was a lot of work. And, along the way, there were times when we were like, is this really going to be worth it? And, is it going to be a good conference? But as soon as we put out registration, within 48 hours, we were sold out of early bird registrations. And so that was kind of the moment when we were like, okay, this is something that people are wanting. This is something that is going to be good. And so that was kind of the moment when we're like, okay, this is worth it. And then today was the last day to get our swag box. We're having swag boxes that are sent to homes, but that was only for the first 150 registrations or by the end of the day today. And so when we sent out an email and put out a call yesterday saying, hey, hurry up and get your swag boxes. And we had 60 registrations in under 24 hours. So that again kind of showed us that there's something about what we're doing that is getting a response. And so we're really, really excited to see what happens at this online conference. And depending on how it goes, we may down the road, in addition to our in-person conference, maybe have a smaller scale one-day online conference, but we'll kind of have to wait and see how this first one goes. So
what do you think it is about LEAD for you personally, or for anyone who's part of the community, that makes people connect with it so strongly? Or why do you love it so much? What about this specific group draws you?
Yeah, I think what it is about LEAD is that there's kind of a similar feeling of a lot of people that show up at LEAD, that in their own context, they feel very isolated. I'm not just talking about your typical isolation in ministry, but more of kind of like feeling like there's something more that should be going on, feeling like there's kind of something that's missing, or feeling like they're crazy with some of the ideas that they throw out with their church or with their community. And so when we get to LEAD and everybody gets together and hears these talks, and again, those are kind of the first thing that kind of helps people feel that they're not alone. And then once they hear that talk and they're like, oh, I'm not alone. And then they talk to someone else about what they experienced and what they heard, and see that there's those connections with how other people were hearing those talks. And so for me, it's having that community where, as soon as I step off the plane in whatever city we're holding the event, like a huge weight just gets lifted. And then after I get off the plane and then start to see people, and then get to the hotel and people start coming in, it's really exciting. It's like going to camp, and seeing all your friends that you haven't seen in a year. And so for me, it's really making those connections and being able to form those relationships. And we've had some people that have criticized LEAD and said that it's kind of like the cool kids table and they feel like they're not invited. And I kind of laugh at that, because it's like, everybody's invited, anybody can go and register and come out. And so we often have people that at the end of the year, at the end of the conference, are like, I always felt like I wasn't going to belong here, or this wasn't my place. But then once I got here, like I had a good experience. And so we really have focused on trying to make sure that it doesn't feel like it's just this small clique, but that anybody who comes can kind of be a part of the family.
So tell me a little bit more about your role as director. You said that you took that on in 2017. So how has that changed your experience of LEAD? What does that entail? What does it mean for you personally?
Yeah, up until the 2016. So I came in the co-director role for a year for the 2016 conference, was in LA, and then rolled into the director position the year after that. And so Rob was the director prior, and Rob Randers is still around. He's a big part of LEAD and still continues to help formulate the conference. But the director role kind of means that I'm where the buck stops. So when it comes to picking a location, that I go out and I'm getting the bids from the hotels, I'm having the conversations with the local churches and putting together a package that then the group then votes on. I'm not just out on an island making those decisions alone. But I'm doing a lot of that kind of groundwork of recruiting the team, putting the team together, recruiting sponsorships. And so I'll be the one that kind of hosts the meeting and calls people together. But through the years, I've gotten better at kind of delegating a lot of the other work. And so we have a great team now. When we went out to GBHEM, one of the things that we decided to do was to actually create a board. And so now UMC Lead has a board, and we have people that are, fully invested in the work of Lead. And so it's been great to be able to, hand over certain aspects of the conference. And so we have, people that work on the speaker team. And so I can just hand that over and, I'll do my check-in, but for the most part, I know that work is going to get done. So we have teams for the speakers and for worship and for those immersion experiences. And so it's been a great opportunity to be able to bring new people into the team. We're always looking for ways to include other people. And so for instance, for this year, when we moved it online, we put out an application. We said, hey, if you want to join our team, just fill out this application and we'll be selecting some new team members. And through that process, we added 4 new people onto our team, and they've done great work.
Awesome. And
so we've been really excited about the opportunity to continue to find ways to bring in new people, not just to the conference, but also into the leadership. Because, I was talking with Rob the other day that when he started the conference, he was about the age that I am now. And then 5 years after that, he kind of handed it over to me. And so I'm trying to find who's that person that, is in their 20s that I can hand the conference over to for a couple of years. And so we're making sure that it's not just as we're getting older, the board is getting older, but we're continuing to find ways to kind of pass on some of the leadership and to bring new ideas from younger generations as well.
So what are your hopes for the future of LEAD, short term and long term?
Yeah, the short term is that we can get back to San Diego. Yeah. And so I'm excited because we were already doing a lot of work, we're going to have 2 years of planning that goes into the San Diego conference, while the other ones were usually year to year. Mm-hmm. So for the conference, that's a big thing. I'm hoping that now with it being online, we've opened it up to a much larger audience. When we do the in-person, we cut it off at 85. And that's for a couple different reasons. First of all of us who are organizers are not paid. We do everything unpaid. We even pay our own way to the conference and our own travel. And so we keep it small in part so that it's a scope that we can handle, but we also keep it small so that everybody who's there has an opportunity to meet everybody else. Because we found that the larger a conference gets, the more kind of cliquish it can be and the harder it can be to actually connect. Yeah. And so by keeping it small, everybody can get to know one another. And so we hope that by having it online, having more people that can connect, that in future years, we can, continue to grow it a little bit. We don't want it to get too large, but find those new ways to bring in new people. Mm-hmm. And then as far as LEAD overall, I mentioned already that we were in the early process of trying to figure out starting some kind of cohort. And so we still want to continue to look at what might be next for LEAD. We don't know what that will be. We kind of have to get down into the nitty-gritty of the brainstorming process to figure out what other ideas might come from it. But I do hope that, 5 or 10 years from now, that LEAD has grown into something even bigger. We don't want to grow too big too quickly, but we do want to find other ways to live into what that mission statement is. So like, what are other ways that we might be able to create that space? And this year is showing us that, maybe creating that space is to have an online in addition to the in-person conference, and putting together those tools. So maybe it is, having some cohort that's put together, or maybe having some other ways of connecting people locally. We've talked for a while about maybe having a couple of just half-day conferences that are spread out so that more people have that opportunity, because not everyone can, hop on a plane and fly and take a couple of days off to go to a conference. And so we're continuing to look at what are some other ways that we can grow and that we can reach more people and that we can help to live into that mission.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that a lot of your members or leaders, you call them on your website, do you find that they live in a certain part of the U.S. or where are they from? Are there groups in various areas?
Yeah. So in the beginning, it was mostly West Coast folks. And that was because the first 2 years it was in Vegas and then it was in Phoenix. But then once we moved it to Austin in the fourth year, we noticed that a lot of people from Texas naturally came to the conference. And so each year, part of moving it around is we kind of get a little bit more of a following. And so like when we came to Charlotte, we had a couple people from North Carolina and South Carolina. And then as we move around, we kind of, pick up a couple more people each year that are the kind of those regulars that come 3, 4, 5, 10 times. Mm-hmm. And then this year for the online conference, because it's so easy to just click a button and hop on, and the cost is a lot lower than what our in-person conferences. And so we found that a big thing is where the speaker's coming from. Yeah. And so this year we already, we have about 160 registrations, and I think 25 of them were from South Carolina. And usually we only have a couple people from South Carolina, and we have 15 from here in North Carolina. You and Kim have both done a great job of advertising in Western North Carolina, and we appreciate the sponsorship as well. And having Sarah here, Sarah Howell-Miller, is one of our speakers. Mm-hmm. And so we've noticed that this year, it's a different group of people from different places than what we usually have. And so it'll be interesting to see what kind of community that is. But yeah, we found that there's pockets. For instance, in St. Louis, there were a couple people that were really active in the conference, and then they would go home. And so the next year, I think one year we had like 10 people from St. Louis that all came together. That's awesome. And so we've also found that happens where there's 1 or 2 people that get really excited about the conference. And then they tell their friends when they get back home. So the next year they bring out 2 or 3 or 4 people from, their church or their friends. And so we found that's kind of the ways that we bring in the most people, is just simply by word of mouth and continuing to make connections. Mm-hmm. The extent of our advertising is, every now and then we throw a little bit into a Facebook ad, and then we'll reach out to some of the conference communicators. But we don't really have a large scale marketing policy. It's more just kind of by word of mouth. And each year we kind of either meet that mark of 85 or come real close to it.
So what are some moments that have been your favorite from past lead conferences over the years?
Yeah. So the time that still for me was the most powerful was that night that Dale Fredrickson put together. He brought in, I don't remember exactly how many, but it was something like 6 or 7 different artists that were either spoken word artists or musicians. And he kind of curated the night in which there were 3 different stages. And I think it was deconstruction, reconstruction, and then new construction or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And so each of the pieces kind of built along those themes. And so it was wonderful music and wonderful spoken word, but then also just the community that it created that night was powerful. And then other than that, as I mentioned, there's not necessarily any particular talks that kind of stand out to me over time. It's more of just those nights after. And so that's another thing, is just remembering when we were in Austin, like Jerry Hershups is going to be leading that mixed drink night, that we went to a bar and they were closing, and Jerry said, just one more round. And the owner said, okay, y'all can come in for 1 round. And so we went in and sat down at the bar, and Jerry started talking to the bartender. And it turned out that the bartender had been had been a member of a Methodist church, but had kind of left church since then because he was gay. And so he didn't feel welcome in most churches, but he had one pastor that was so welcoming to him and put him in leadership, and that it kind of transformed who he was. But then that pastor, as we do in Methodist churches, was moved and he kind of grew apart from the church. But it was great to be able to just sit there and just strike up this conversation with this random guy who, otherwise we wouldn't have known who he was or known anything about his story, but to be able to connect and kind of hear about what he was going through in that moment, and then also what he had been through in his life, was a moment where we really kind of got to see that Jerry Hershup's at work. If you're familiar with Jerry, or if you know Jerry, he's a great guy and has wonderful stories, and to be able to just kind of spend that time with him. And then again, the other times are just kind of those conversations that happen over lunch, those conversations that happen in the breakout groups, and being able to just kind of get to know one another. And then this last year in Seattle, that closing dinner that we had was also something that was special, because the relationships build as the conference goes along. And then that last night when most everybody knows each other, and to be able to sit down across the table from each other and, pass food around and, eating with our hands, which now in the time of COVID, people are probably even more terrified of that thought. But it was great. And it was kind of the last thing that I did before the pandemic too. And so because of that, it's something that I've really reflected back on, because it was, only a month or so after that things started to shut down. And so I was grateful that the conference was when it was, because if our conference was in March instead of January, we probably wouldn't have had it in 2020. And so, I really do look back on that time and appreciate it. And I also appreciate it because now it's going to be, 2 years before we get back together instead of just one. So while I am really looking forward to the online conference in a couple weeks, I really hope that a lot of people will then take the opportunity next year to come join us in San Diego.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like this is really soul-filling for you. So how does this tie into your calling as a pastor? How does this provide some inspiration to keep you going in your everyday ministry and work?
Yeah. I honestly don't even know if I'd still be in ministry if it weren't for Lead. And I don't just say that as a throwaway comment. I really genuinely mean it, because as I mentioned before, a lot of times it can be really isolating in ministry and feel like what's going on? Am I alone? And so being able to be exposed to that community when I was still in seminary, and kind of hear some of those stories, good and bad, kind of prepared me for what it would be like to be in ordained ministry. And then I went through a really difficult time a couple years ago of wondering, do I ask for a new appointment? Do I turn in my credentials? Do I, transition my orders? Like what am I going to do? And it was those folks that I met at Lead that were the first people that I would make that phone call to or hop in a Zoom call with, and kind of hear their stories as well. And some other friends in Lead that have been in similar situations that I've been able to be that person on the other end when they called. And so there's some people that have, shared in all honesty that they're not sure if they would still be in ministry or the same form of ministry if it weren't for Lead. And while others have transitioned out of ministry because of Lead, right? And so it's not just that Lead says, stick through it, you can make it. It's also that we help people in their discernment process. And so there's some people that have discerned that they want to either maybe leave the local church and go into extension ministry or transition their orders from elder to deacon, or some that have, been in the ordination process and either pulled out or stayed in. And so I think a big part of it is just being able to be there with a group that, kind of understands where you are and what you're going through. And so that's been the greatest part of Lead, again, is those relationships that have formed where I know if I need to pick up a phone and call somebody, that there's a long list of people that I've met at Lead, because some of my closest friends are on the West Coast now because of Lead. And I never would have met them if it weren't for Lead. Like maybe by chance I would have run into them But the great part about being so small and being able to connect with people is being able to see what's different, right? So, what Rob's living in Tucson, but what Rob experienced in Tucson and Phoenix, what my friend Kim is experiencing in Sacramento, or Chris is experiencing in Reno, is very different from what I'm going to experience in Charlotte or in Canton. And so being able to expose to different ways of doing ministry, to learn that, our district has more clergy than some of their entire conferences. Wow, yeah. And, some of their conferences are so large that, expands across states. And so then to be in North Carolina, where we have two of the largest conferences in just one state, is a vastly different understanding of the United Methodist Church than what they're experiencing in the West Coast. And so that's another piece of it, is just being able to get to know different perspectives. And likewise for them, when I say that what's different is for them to then reach out to me and learn that, in the Southeastern jurisdiction, it is very different from the Western jurisdiction. And there are a ton of clergy. And to hear that, we have more young clergy than they have clergy under the age of 60. Right. And so it's things like that, gaining that perspective has been a big piece of Lead as well, where I've gotten to know things and know people that I wouldn't have otherwise.
So you've mentioned a lot about this upcoming conference, but is there anything else you want to highlight that people should expect? Or any advice you have for people who want to get involved, who should come?
So I think you said that this will be airing next Tuesday. Yes. So by then we'll probably be to our late registration, which will be $49. And anyone can join us. As I've said before, that, anyone is welcome to join and welcome to register and participate. But it really is especially for those that feel like they're alone and isolated, which that number is, I'm sure, much more now than it was before. And we also hope that people come not expecting to be told what to do. There's been a couple people that have come out to Lead and have not had a good time. And when we do the surveys at the end of the year, they kind of share that, they were expecting to be told exactly how someone started up their church, or, wanting to get deeper into the weeds. And it's like, that's not what our conference is really about. If you want to, by all means, you can go and talk to that speaker and you can learn those nuts and bolts if that's what you're wanting. But we, again, are kind of creating that space. So we're not going to give you those 5 steps. We're not going to tell you exactly what to do. Our talks might not be as polished as what you might hear from someone who's given the same talk 37 different times in 37 different conferences. But instead, what you're going to experience is something that's pretty vulnerable and pretty raw. And so we do work with our speakers because we want them to have it as clean as possible, but we're not looking for something that's perfect. We're looking for people to share their stories. And so really that it's a conference for us to be able to kind of leave our expectations at the door and just be open to other people's stories. Because if you really don't like a talk, don't worry, because there's 13 more. Right. I've been surprised because there have been times where we have been selecting speakers and someone is selected as a speaker and I'm like, I don't think that talk is going to be any good. And then we get to the conference and that's the talk that has, impresses me the most. Or, other times where I'm really excited about a talk and then that talk happens and it just kind of falls flat. Or times where I've been at the conference and heard a talk and I was like, that really wasn't very good. And then I turned to the person next to me and asked them which one was their favorite. And it was that one that I thought wasn't very good. And so that's the beauty of being able to have 14 different speakers across 2 days, while other conferences might have, 2 or 3 keynotes that speak for an hour or, speak for an hour and then do that 4 times over. And so we're not going to be going into great detail like you would if you have 4 hours to talk about something. It's just a matter of scratching the surface just to get us thinking a little bit differently. And so that's why we often refer to our talks as springboards, that it's not that the talks are everything, but it kind of launches you into thinking differently, launches you into looking into a different perspective. And so that's why we like to have 14 different talks from 14 different perspectives on 14 different subjects. And so we're really excited about this lineup this year. And we're kind of ready to see what happens from it, but not just what happens from those talks, but what happens with the conversations in between.
That's fantastic. Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon, for your time. This was a great conversation. And we'll include all the links to register for LEAD or to get involved in our show notes. So thanks for being with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.